afternoon, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed your lunch and the break, and you're now revitalized and ready for more stimulating presentations and discussion. I'm very happy to be introducing Professor Barry O'Sullivan today. Barry O'Sullivan is Professor of Applied Linguistics and Director of the Centre for Language Assessment Research at Roehampton University in London. He has written 2 books on language testing. There's Issues in Business English Testing, published by Cambridge University Press, Modelling Performance in Test of Spoken Language, published by Peter Lang, and 2 edited volumes will appear in the coming year. There's Language Testing Theories and Practices by Paul Grave, and a collection of articles from theory to practice, a teacher's guide to language assessment, published by Cambridge University Press. In addition to his many publications, he has presented his work at conferences around the world. Barry is active in language testing globally, working with ministries, universities, and examination boards. Recent projects include developing affordable tests for Mexico, CFR linking projects in the UK, Mexico and Turkey, and major international placement tests for the British Council.
I should start by thanking all of you for coming this afternoon. I nearly missed it myself, looking at some very interesting posters out there. To be reminded to come in. And I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me. It's a really great honour and a privilege to be asked to talk at this conference, because Pablo was a good friend who I've known for many years. Started with a pint in the Queen's Head pub about 18 years ago, I've been reminded. And has went on ever since. We would always have our discussions at our testing conferences, because we shared quite a lot of interest, particularly in the area of testing speaking. And when we met up first, that was consuming probably both of our lives, as we were both trying to do PhDs, I guess, at the time. We were in various stages of panic, probably, as we were wondering, would this thing ever get finished? Both of us did, finally. And we continued to talk about these kind of areas for many years afterwards. So he was a great character. And as sad and all as last time was, my own memories of him are always with a massive grin in his face, usually winding me up over something, because I have this aura of being very casual and relaxed, but he was a man who knew how to get under your skin if he wanted to and wind you up. He would have been a very good Irishman, actually. You were lucky you got him over here. We would have had him anytime. I'm going to have to readjust my screen so I can see it now. We've been having great fun with this presentation, trying to get it to open. It's done all kinds of damage. My computer at home stopped working a few days ago when I was finishing it. Then my laptop stopped working. Then I sent it here and it wouldn't open. So I was thinking, good God, I'd have to just stand here and talk to you about whatever comes into my head. When I mentioned that idea to John DeYoung down here, he said, that'll be boring. So let's hope it's not that boring. We can keep John awake for a while. That's what. So, when I was asked to do the talk, I said, well, what would be really interesting for me is to go back over where a lot of my stuff began and where I was coming from, what I was thinking of at that time, and how did it link into other things that were going on, both in testing and in my own head. And while I go back a fair number of years, I don't quite go back as far as I'm going to go back today to look at the beginning of modern testing of speaking and take a quick look at how it's developed over the years. I was going to spend more time on that topic, but I thought I'd just bore you. So then I thought I would move on from that, look at a theoretical model of test validation and development, which was developed originally by Sarah Weir and myself 10 years ago. He published a version of it about 6 years ago, and we've been updating it ever since. But I want to show you how it links into the idea of what I think we should be doing properly and what we're doing badly now And I kind of end up with a criticism, really, of what current practice is. So those of you who are engaged in current practice, be ready for a small bit of criticism. Including myself, of course. Nothing's perfect. The first formal exam that we know of English to hit the international market was the CPE, the Certificate of Proficiency in English, in 1913. And that gives you an idea of what the test looked like. If you take a look at the bottom part, you see what the speaking test included. It included a dictation, a half-an-hour dictation, followed by a reading aloud, followed by what was called a conversation. And can you imagine now a speaking test that went on for about an hour and 20 minutes? People would not be queuing up to take your test, shall we say, if that was what your test looked like. It's kind of interesting when you look at it, that's what the test was. And that was the core of the speaking. When we think that this test was actually developed based on the ideas of Sweet, who was the educational philosopher from the late 19th century, and his whole idea was that you learn a language by using it. And when we think that this was the interpretation, and that was probably it was definitely the only and the best current interpretation of how Sweet's ideas could be put into practice in an actual exam. I thought it was interesting as well to look at English phonetics, which is taken out of the actual production side. It has nothing to do, we don't care what your phonetics are like, obviously, but you have to know what they are. You have to be able to identify the phonetic system, etc. So it was a test of your knowledge, rather than a test of your ability to actually make any noises. You didn't actually have to make any sounds in that test. Obviously that wouldn't happen nowadays, we think, but you take the national entrance test in Japan in English, and there's a section that looks very similar to that one, where you're given words and you have to identify where the stress is by putting a point or identifying which of 4 points in a word is the position of the right stress. Gary Buck took that apart in 1991 in a paper he published, and it was just completely ignored. It's still in the test. So we laugh at this now, but 100 years later it's still happening. And I'm sure you've come across exams where people's pronunciation or knowledge of phonetics are tested without actually having to make a noise. It's hilarious. If we look at what Cambridge did then over the following century, really, we can see that the test in its form as we see here, the dictation didn't last all that long. It was gone by the 1930s. Whereas the rest of it, the phonetics went, the dictation, reading and conversation stayed more or less exactly as it was until 1975. It didn't really change at all. At that point it was changed to an interview. And it was later, 96, that in the FCE, and then later, a few years later, in the revision of the CPE, that the paired format was introduced. It's really interesting, isn't it, when you look at it, for somebody to look at their tests more or less every 10 years and not to do anything. You wonder why nothing happens, nothing changes. And probably one of the reasons why nothing changes is that people don't question. Test takers don't question. Teachers rarely question. People began to question more probably in a later part of the 20th century, which is when things began to happen. But even then, when questions were asked, about the paired task, there's a lot of problems with the paired task that people don't really know how to deal with. And they don't know how to deal with it, so they bury their head in the sand and just do what's always been done. I'm going to come back to that point later on. So what was being tested? Well, in the dictation, we could argue that we were testing a person's listening ability. We might argue that we were testing their writing, maybe their handwriting, maybe that was it, maybe their spelling. There's a few things that you could say we're testing, but I don't think at any point you could argue that you're testing a person's speaking or oral ability. In the reading aloud, well, you're testing their pronunciation, their intonation, their ability to make the noises of the language. And even if you are doing that, what does it mean? You know, there are plenty of people around who are very good mimics, who can reproduce the sound that a person makes quite easily. And because I don't speak any German, the only German I ever learned was Ich spreche nicht Deutsch, or I can't even remember now. Because once in my life I was in Tokyo Station and this German woman walked up to me and she asked me, Sprechen Sie Deutsch? And what did I say? No. Because brain went into overload. What was that German phrase? I can't speak German. But because of the sounds of Irish language and the sounds of German, you know, the sounds we have all over the place. So I have no problem sounding like a German. So you can give me something and I can read it like a German. I have no idea what I'm doing. Absolutely, I won't understand anything. But I can sound reasonably good because I can make all of the noises. So what am I testing? Is it the noise of the language I'm testing? Or is it my ability to reproduce those noises? Does that tell you anything about my ability to learn German? I doubt it, because all these years I've never managed anything except Ich spreche nicht Deutsch, or whatever, I can't even remember that bit. So I'm pretty useless at it. In terms of conversation then, is it a genuine conversation? We know from Van Leer and various people over 20 years ago that the language that occurs in a test is highly unlikely to be conversational-like. Although I would have agreed with that completely, 100%, until this last year when I was asked by an exam board in the UK to look at their exams, which, without telling you what the name is, they're on 12 levels and they're testing speaking. We were looking at the underlying construct. And in the process of doing the project, we looked at dozens and dozens and dozens of videos of people performing the test. And in one task, which they called interactive, which I laughed at on the first day of the meeting, said it's highly unlikely that a 9-year-old kid is going to have a true interaction with an adult. You know, grow up. It doesn't happen. It's not real. I was wrong. It happens. It happened in almost every test. So you could probably claim to test conversation if you were really very careful. But you have to be really very careful. And it only works in one small way. And that is where you eliminate the power differences between the two people who are interacting. And this was done in a beautiful way by asking the candidate to prepare a topic. And then the testers, who were very well trained, it has to be said, who would say things like, you know, what's your topic? Or one little kid said, oh, I'm going to talk about Star Wars. And the examiner said, oh, what about Star Wars? And the little kid says, oh, I've seen all the films. And the examiner says, oh, I've only seen one. What? You've only seen one Star Wars? That's ridiculous. And this little kid just went off. It reminded me a bit like myself. You know, I usually have my daily rant. And this kid went off and he told us, oh God, you have to see this one. And as for that one, you'd really like this one. It was amazing. Because then the guy started to ask questions about the other films. Not because they were on the script, because they wanted to know. Of course, how you make comparisons between all the different tests is another story, but you can. This was an example of a true interaction, I believe, and it happened time and time again, so it wasn't a fluke. And the whole point of this is the equality angle. If there's any, in a traditional test, there's always an inequality. It's bound to happen. It's reality. We're fooling ourselves, I think, that it's not. So that the two people who are interacting, if it's an interview, one is going to have a higher status than the other, for one reason or another.